Biological Psychology, the Central Nervous System, Part 2. This goes along with pages 54 to 73 in your textbook. How is my brain wired? In the CNS, different functions are performed by different networks of neurons. Clusters of neurons are called nuclei, and pathways that connect the networks are bundles of axons called fiber tracts. The spinal cord. The spinal cord receives and sends signals to and from the brain. Reflexes are simple, involuntary behaviors controlled by spinal cord neurons without requiring instructions from the brain. Reflexes are controlled by a feedback system. Information about the consequences of an action goes back to the source of the action for further adjustment if necessary. The brain. A number of tools have been developed for monitoring the brain's structure and activity. The earliest technique is called an electroencephalogram, or an EEG, which measures general electrical activity through electrodes on the scalp. A newer technique is a positron emission tomography, or a PET scan, which records the location of radioactive substances that were injected into the bloodstream. These show the location of brain activity during specific tasks. Magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, records radio frequency waves after exposure to a magnetic field, providing clear pictures of the anatomical structure of the brain. A functional MRI, or fMRI, detects changes in blood flow to provide a moving picture of neuronal activities. The newest techniques provide even more information about brain activity, structure, and functioning. These include diffusion tensor imaging, DTI, and transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS. And now we'll look at the parts of the brain. The hindbrain. The hindbrain is found just above the spinal cord and is composed of the following structures: the medulla, the reticular formation, and the cerebellum. The medulla controls vital life functions like blood pressure, heart rate, and breathing. The reticular formation is a web of neurons involved in arousal and attention. The cerebellum coordinates fine motor movements, stores a memory code for well-rehearsed behaviors, and participates in cognitive tasks such as reading. Here are your definitions. The midbrain. The tiny midbrain relays information from the eyes, ears, and skin and controls certain types of automatic behaviors. The midbrain and its connections to the forebrain permit the smooth initiation of movement. The forebrain. The forebrain, the largest part of the brain, regulates many complex aspects of behavior and mental phenomena. Interior structures include the following: thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, hippocampus, cerebral cortex, and corpus callosum. Major structures of the forebrain. The structures of the forebrain are covered by an outer bark known as the cerebral cortex. This diagram shows some of the structures that lie within the forebrain. The amygdala, the hippocampus, and portions of the cerebral cortex are part of the limbic system. The thalamus processes input from sense organs, except for smell, and then relays sensory information to appropriate higher forebrain areas. It is the primary sensory relay into the rest of the brain. The hypothalamus regulates many physiological feedback systems, coordinating hunger, thirst, temperature regulation, and sexual behavior. It directly influences both the autonomic and endocrine systems. It is the brain's clock that sets biological rhythms for the body. The limbic system includes the amygdala and the hippocampus. The amygdala is involved in memory and emotion. It links different kinds of sensory information together in memory. The amygdala also plays a role in fear and other emotions, linking emotions to sensations. The hippocampus is critical to the ability to form new memories. The cerebral cortex. The forebrain's outer surface, the cerebral cortex, is a thin sheet of neurons. In humans, the sheet folds in on itself, giving the brain its characteristic wrinkled appearance. The cerebral cortex is divided down the middle, creating two halves called the left and right cerebral hemispheres. The corpus callosum connects the two halves. The folds of the cortex produce ridges or fissures on the brain's outer surface. Several deep ridges make convenient markers for dividing the cortex of each hemisphere into four anatomical areas: the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. Sensory and motor cortex. The sensory cortex and the motor cortex are two of the functional areas of the cortex. Each region of the sensory cortex receives and processes input from a single sensory organ. Inputs from the eyes are sent to the visual cortex in the occipital lobe. Inputs from the ears are sent to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. Inputs from the skin sensory organs connect to the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. Neighboring body areas send somatosensory inputs to neighboring parts of the somatosensory cortex. This pattern of brain organization is called a homonucleus. Neurons in the motor cortex in the frontal lobe initiate voluntary movements of specific body parts. These neurons are organized so that the combined activity of neighboring groups of neurons controls movements of neighboring body regions. The association cortex. Most of the cortex in each lobe is association cortex, with no specific sensory inputs or direct motor outputs. Rather, the association cortex combines inputs from various senses and is involved in many different mental processes. Some regions of the association cortex are specifically involved in language processing. Broca's area is a region of association cortex, usually in the left frontal lobe. Damage to this region causes difficulty speaking smoothly and grammatically, a condition called Broca's aphasia. Wernicke's area is a region of the association cortex, usually in the left temporal lobe. Damage to this region leaves fluency intact but makes it difficult to understand the meaning of words or to speak understandably. Other association areas in the front of the brain, called the prefrontal cortex, are involved in complex, higher-level thought processes. The physically separate left and right hemispheres of the brain perform different functions. Most sensory and motor pathways cross as they enter or leave the brain. As a result, the left hemisphere receives information from and controls movement of the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere does the same for the left side of the body. Studies of split brain patients highlight the different functions of the two hemispheres. The left and right hemispheres communicate through the corpus callosum, a bundle of over 1 million fibers. To relieve seizures in some epilepsy patients, a split brain operation cuts the corpus callosum. In such patients, the two hemispheres operate somewhat independently of each other. Special techniques were used to present information to only the left or right hemisphere of split brains. Patients could verbally name one of those objects shown to the left hemisphere. They could use their hands to recognize objects shown to either hemisphere. This suggested that the left hemisphere, more than the right, is specialized for language. The right hemisphere appears to be specialized for tasks involving spatial relationships and recognizing human faces. Because of the corpus callosum connection, the two hemispheres work closely together. Brain shows synaptic plasticity, or strengthening or weakening of synapses over time. This may be the physical basis for forming memories and learning new things. Brain damage is hard to repair because the adult nervous system does not automatically replace damaged cells and restore lost functions. A number of surgical techniques have tried to help damaged central nervous systems. And that concludes Part 2, the central nervous system.